Looks like the clicker is yeah. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so thanks for all of you to coming out, for Professor Tollefson for the kind invitation. And up front, I just want to thank some of my collaborators on this project that I'll present to you today. So I'm actually excited to share that some of the work that I'll be discussing with you today, I just found out is forthcoming in the American Psychologist. So there'll be a journal article coming out in the next few weeks that I'd be happy to share preprints of for those that are interested. But so my collaborators on this project that I'm working with, Kieran O'Doherty, who's a psychologist at the University of Guelph, Phoebe Friesen, who's a bioethicist at McGill University. We've worked on a number of projects in this area, and much of the work I'm sharing with you today is collaborations with these two. And I'd also like to thank Professor Regina Rini, who, although not a collaborator on this project, through a series of talks and kind of public op-eds and things she's written, really inspired my own thinking on the topic. So for my money, she's one of the best sort of public philosophers doing, really public-facing work on the ethics of emerging technology. And so if any of you are familiar with her work, you'll probably see it in the talk today. Okay, so what's the big picture? Well, it's probably no surprise to this group that you can open up the front page of the New York Times or any mainstream publication, and we're often told that artificial intelligence and machine learning are transforming many aspects of society, and they're going to impact all areas of life. I mean, it's really impossible now to read a news story that doesn't begin with this sort of opening. And so my intuition is that clickers. No, it's okay. No worries. No worries. So, my intuition throughout this presentation and through much of my work is that if this is true, that AI and machine learning are going to be impacting, all aspects of society, and that all people are going to potentially be affected by it in terms of their work, their leisure, their play. If that's really the case, and there's some reasons to think that's true, there's some reasons to maybe push back on some of that hype. But if it is true, then I think it's more important than ever to make sure that people whose lives and livelihoods are going to be affected by those technologies have a significant say in how they're developed and how they're deployed. And so one guiding worry that frames much of my recent work is that this isn't the case, right? That often the people who are most affected by the technologies tend not to have a say in their development and deployment. And so that's the kind of big picture context for what I'll be talking about today. So the talk today is going to look at the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in mental health applications. So that's going to be the case study. And so all the examples will be sort of broadly in the domain of AI for mental health. That said, I hope that the dynamics and the examples that I give, I think they'll generalize beyond that context, right? So I think many of the arguments, many of the criticisms that I'll raise will sort of straightforwardly apply to many other medical contexts, but also to broader contexts as well. And so yes, that will be what all the examples are, but my sort of eye or my scope is much bigger than just the mental health context. And so the kind of big questions in the background that I hope we'll have the chance to discuss and will sort of stimulate in some of your thinking are these questions about when we collect data, for example, about various health outcomes, who is it that has the authority to speak about that, right? So very much in the background of the talk today is going to be questions about who has the authority to speak for who. All right, so here's the tension I want to explore in the talk today. I think that if we look at the last 20 or 30 years or so, we see that across the board, across the physical sciences, the social sciences, humanities, there's increasing recognition of the value of participatory research methods in science generally. And this is also true in mental health specifically. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that in a second. But on the one hand, we see this recognition that participatory approaches can be really useful, they can be really helpful. And then on the other hand, right, many approaches in artificial intelligence and machine learning, fueled by ever-growing, constantly growing numbers of sensors, multimodal data analysis techniques, they run this risk of further distancing participants from the research process and rendering individuals not so much as people with inner lives and hopes and dreams, and more like data points or vectors or rows on data frames. So that's the tension I want to explore. And so here's the plan for doing it. First, I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by this idea of a participatory turn in mental health research. And again, you can kind of scale that out to other health science more generally. In the first part. In the second part of the talk, I'll do a quick review of what I take to be some of the most interesting and important developments in artificial intelligence and machine learning methods for mental health. And then in the third and final part of the talk, I'll step back and ask, okay, like, do these things go together? Are they compatible? And so that's where we're going. The first thing I want to do is just say a little bit more about this idea of a participatory turn in mental health research. And so to give you a sense of the aim of the first part of the talk, I'll sort of review really quickly a vast body of literature with this aim of identifying or extracting what I'm going to call two core principles of participatory research. Okay. So, being as how I am trained as a philosopher, the first thing I have to do in a talk is define my terms. So I just want to note that throughout the talk, I'll be using these terms like patient and service user interchangeably, even though there's a fair bit of variability in how people often prefer to be referred to, right? Some are fine with the term client or patient, some prefer survivors or ex-patients, and so I sort of recognize it's a contested term, but for the purposes of the talk, I use those two interchangeably. So what I have in mind is briefly what the philosopher of psychiatry, Sharif Tekin, calls the individual who is in a position of need due to the distress she's experiencing and who seeks help from a professional. Okay, so that's what I have in mind when I use that term. And so the last terminological clarification is that it's pretty common nowadays to talk about research participants in studies, and so that's fine. That's a terminological shift over the last 20 or 30 years. But that's a pretty thin idea or a pretty non-robust sense of participation. So when I'm talking about research being participatory, what I mean is for the subjects of research to be substantively engaged with different aspects of the research process. So these include things like contributing to the design and analysis, decisions about who gets funded and how, and inclusion in the governance processes, right? So it's more than just saying, participate in a study. Okay, so the sort of big picture is that a lot of historians and sort of sociologists of science have argued for decades that publics have a rightful place in the governance of science and technology. If for no other reason, then very many forms of this research rely on public funding in some cases, and even if it doesn't, they tend to have broad ramifications for public policy issues that have impacts on very many different people. Right? And so, as I mentioned on one of the first slides, so much of what I'm going to talk about today and so much of my own work is guided by what I take to be this sort of completely obvious and intuitive idea that people should just have a say in matters that significantly impact them. Right? And so I think that intuition is at the heart of this idea of participatory research. So what I want to do is just quickly review some of the arguments or some of the reasons or justifications that people have used for including participants in research, right? So I think there's two broad categories. You can talk about epistemic justifications related to the production of knowledge on the one hand, and then we can also consider ethical reasons or ethical justifications for including participants in research. So in mental health specifically, there's a long history of this sort of work. And so this often takes the forms of various critiques of the status quo and institutional forms of psychiatry, which are, have long been criticized for sort of neglecting structural, social, economic issues in the favor of more standard biomedical approaches, the use of harmful restraints, the use of coercion, and stigmatizing stereotypes. So I won't get into all that here, except to say that this is a sort of long-standing and widely known literature. So here's just a few examples of some of the different schools of thought or theories that have engaged in this kind of critique of standard forms of mental health research and psychiatry. All right, so what are some of the reasons why you might think participatory research is a good idea? Well, I want to just start by saying, if you've never heard of this stuff before, you might have this worry, and it's a worry that I myself had when I first started reading in this area, that participatory research is it's really subjective, it's too qualitative, it's not rigorous, it's kind of squishy, right? And then particularly in mental health, you might think that it's just biased and that it's sort of driven by people who are overly involved and have, very clear political agendas. And, as I said, like, this is a criticism that I myself was worried about. And I think there's something to it. But the more I've read, right, the more you see that there's just documented empirical evidence about these positive impacts of engaging patients and service user communities in health research, right? To the point where there's a number of now decade-old systematic reviews documenting the positive impact of participant engagement, right? So you see things like improved recruitment in participatory methods. You see increased retention in studies. You see wider dissemination of research. You see different and more varied outcomes that are often perceived as more highly relevant to the communities that are impacted. You see the generation of new hypotheses, right? And so these are just kind of some instrumental reasons you might give in favor of engaging more substantively with participants in research, right? One of the main ways that I tend to think about the instrumental or epistemic value of all of this is that there is a unique kind of knowledge, or maybe even a unique kind of expertise that comes from, on the one hand, like having an experience of mental illness, or on the other hand, kind of engaging in a first-person way with providers of mental health services, right? And so we tend to think about expertise as like the thing that only trained clinicians can have, or we tend to think of expertise as the things that like is sort of signified by academic credentials. And for sure, right, that's one important kind of expertise. But what these participatory researchers, I think, are really pressing us to see is that it's not the only kind. Right, there's a distinct kind of knowledge and expertise that can come from the lived experience of mental illness or engaging with the healthcare system. Right, and so one of the ways that we see this manifest in terms of like tangible outcomes or benefits to research is that these communities who are dealing with either the first person experience of mental illness or encounters with various parts of the healthcare system is that they're often quite able to identify problematic assumptions that researchers themselves may overlook in stating a research question. And they can develop novel hypotheses, novel interpretations of data. And I think many have argued, and I find myself sort of sympathetic to these views, that it actually leads to a stronger form of objectivity in research, not a more objective or not necessarily more subjective or qualitative, right? But by taking into account those multiple perspectives, what you arrive at is something that is actually a stronger form of objectivity, despite that worry from the first slide. Okay, so that's one way you might make the argument for including participants in research. Another way you might go is by way of an ethical justification, right? And so you might just say that those who are directly impacted by various form of research have a right to contribute to the guidance of such research. Okay, and so this idea is often captured in the motto or slogan of many of these approaches that say nothing about us without us. Right? And so the idea here is, it's not so much that generating knowledge is, good for research or it allows you to have higher relevance or higher dissemination. The justification in this vein is very much more, well, they just deserve it. Right? They especially deserve it because the subjects of research are often disproportionately taking on the greatest risks and benefits. So you just say, like, given that they're taking on a bunch of risk, they just deserve to have a say in how the research is designed, conducted, interpreted, and disseminated. Empirical evidence just shows, right? When you ask service user communities, almost all of them agreed that they, wish they had more of a say in the way research was designed, developed, deployed, disseminated. This is an area where, again, this will be a little bit specific to mental health, but it bears mentioning. The sort of history of mental health treatment in psychiatry is one that is unfortunately littered with examples that, with the benefit of hindsight, now seem indistinguishable from torture techniques, right? So forced lobotomies, bleeding, insulin comas, forced sterilization, right? These are all sort of unfortunate instances of treatments that have been deployed. Now, it's easy to think that, yeah, that's all in the past. We're in a so much more enlightened place now, but that's a bit too hasty, right? So a bunch of good work from Human Rights Watch and other organizations shows that these techniques are, some of them not only relics of the past, but that many people with and suffering from mental illness are often treated as having diminished agency, diminished decisional capacity, and as a result are subjected to treatments and restrictions of freedom which otherwise wouldn't be justifiable. All right. So the last point to make in this kind of introductory section is that I think it makes sense to think about these participatory methods that I'm describing as a corrective, right? And so one of the main driving ideas here is that involving participants more actively and substantively in research serves to balance what I think is an unfair distribution of power, in which one group, namely those with medical expertise or those with, data science prowess, are always in the position of speaking for others, right? So that people who have the sort of academic or clinical or diagnostic form of expertise are always in the position of speaking on behalf of the people who they're, claiming to study or develop insights about. And so I think that the scales have been tipped very, heavily in favor of the diagnostic and clinical forms of expertise, and they've been tipped very far against the sort of first person or experiential forms of expertise. And so the participatory methods that I'm describing are meant to try to bring those a bit more into balance. Right? They can also be seen as protectionist, right? So given the harms discussed in the previous slide, you might think that something like these methods are required to prevent continued harm from occurring, right? So finding members of the most vulnerable groups who have been harmed in the past, making sure they have a real seat at the table in deciding how these methods and these research programs go forward in the future. And it also has a restorative component, right? So shifting power back to those who have been harmed can repair or restore forms of injustice from the past, right? So I take that, all of this, I'm sort of moving quickly here through a large body of literature, but the idea is, we can give these epistemic or, knowledge-based reasons in favor of participatory methods. We can appeal to ethical considerations in favor of using these methods. And so when I combine these together, in my work, I've sort of pulled out or identified what I think are two important participatory principles. Okay, and so I'm going to use these principles in the next section when I'm looking at some of the use cases in AI and machine learning to determine whether or not they go together and they're compatible. Right. So the first principle that I think we can pull out is an ethical and epistemic commitment to the value and richness of lived experience in knowledge production about mental health. Right. And again, I kind of put mental health here in brackets, but I think that you could sort of replace that with any number of health outcomes you might be interested in. And you might think, well, yeah, that's totally obvious. Obviously, people should pay attention to the symptoms and the experience of the illness they're trying to cure if they're going to study it. You might just think that's so obvious. Why would anyone even say that? Well, as Sharifa Tekin has shown, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, right, the main manual we use for diagnosing mental illness in the United States, they've never included service users as either subjects who generate research on mental illness, nor as decision makers, right? They never serve on the task forces, they're never on any of the committees. To the extent they're included at all in DSM research, they are almost always the objects of investigation, right? And so while it might seem totally obvious that we should take, the first person experience of mental illness into account when developing strategies to study it and cure it, systematically that almost never happens at the highest levels of the professions. Right. So to sort of reiterate a point I've been hinting at so far, the participatory approaches I'm interested in emphasize that there is a unique and distinctive form of expertise that's generated from the lived experience of mental illness. And that's distinct from, and it's not the same thing as the kind of expertise that we normally associate with clinical training and certifications. All right, so that's this first participatory principle, the value and richness of lived experience. Okay, so the second one is what I'm calling an ethical and epistemic commitment to stakeholders, whether as individuals or as groups, being able to speak for themselves on their own terms. Right. So I think once, if you're sort of on board with the first principle I just laid out, if you're on board with that, once the distinctive value or the distinctive expertise is recognized, then the epistemic advantages of occupying that position in a society, having that experience with mental illness, engaging with various aspects of the healthcare system in various ways, once you recognize the distinct epistemic value that comes with that, you can only really realize that, or the benefits only come to fruition when people who occupy those standpoints or those positions can describe it or talk about it on their own terms, right? And so this is a key point, I think, is that we need to be mindful and I think concerted to make sure that we build, establish, and maintain venues where stakeholders can articulate their perspectives and be heard by researchers, clinicians, and policymakers, right? This doesn't happen organically. This doesn't happen on its own. This has to be sort of actively undertaken. So given the kind of historical imbalances of power I discussed a few slides ago, right? Like if we don't do anything, I think that's the balance of power that results. And so unless we're actively and I think mindfully creating these venues where stakeholders can speak about their experience in a way that's on their own terms, if we don't do that on purpose, right, it's not going to happen. And so we need to make sure that we're purposefully building in those venues into research processes and governance and oversight processes. All right, so that's it for like the whirlwind tour of these participatory research methods, right? So what I want to do now is quickly review some of what I take to be the most interesting and important developments in recent work using AI and ML to study various aspects of mental health, right? And so I've got 4 broad categories here, which are by no means exhaustive. I mean, there are new papers, as you know, probably published on this topic every day. And so, you work on this stuff and 6 months later, it's already out of date. So I don't claim this is at all exhaustive, but I do think it's representative. And so I'm going to consider these use cases with an eye towards, in the last section of the talk, trying to figure out, do they go against those participatory principles I just laid out, or can they be reconciled? All right, so here's a really nice quote I like from the eminent psychologist Stanley Milgram. He says, if the world were drained of every individual and we were left only with the messages that passed between them, we would still be in possession of the information needed to construct our discipline, right? Discipline of psychology. This, all the way back in 1977. And so it's probably unsurprising that one of the hottest and most widely funded and researched fields in psychology generally, and mental health in particular, has to do with language and linguistic analysis, right? So in a recent review of 400 mental health studies, this recent group found that natural language processing methods are used in many text corpora relevant to mental health, including social media posts, direct messages, transcripts of clinical interviews, free writing, narrative writing, clinical notes written by providers, and electronic health records. And of course, the sort of advent and widespread availability of large language models like ChatGPT and GPT-4 are only likely to turbocharge this interest, right? And so I think it was true back in 1977. It was true in 2020. It's even more true in 2023 that linguistic analysis is going to be at the forefront of much research in psychology in general and mental health in particular. So here's just a sort of brief overview of a number of influential and highly cited studies where natural language processing methods have been used to predict things like psychosis, depression, suicidality, eating disorders, self-injurious thoughts and behaviors, autism, bipolar, and again, the list can go on. I mean, it's almost as if, any mental health diagnosis you can think of, probably some form of machine learning, AI, or data science has been used to investigate it. I think, if you follow the news circa, 2017, 2018, a lot of these approaches were in the headlines, right? So when it came out that in 2018, right, Facebook was kind of behind the scenes monitoring direct messages and posts and even Facebook Live video to assess suicide risk. You've seen companies like Beacon, right, who famously tried to identify users in someone's Twitter social network, that someone in their network, may be experiencing a mental health crisis and trying to nudge them to reach out to see if they need support. There was a lot of attention around these efforts to use sort of big data tools generally with the treasure trove of linguistic data that's present in social media posts to research and intervene on various aspects of mental health. So I think it's true that the approaches for social media tend to garner the most headlines. And if people have sort of heard about it in the area, that's probably one thing they're familiar with. But I think that the sort of bibliometric analyses are pretty convincing in that the vast majority of work that happens for NLP and mental health involves electronic health records, right? So that's sort of long been and continues to be one of the fastest growing areas where we see, the greatest number of publications. So Now, that said, social media activity does generate all these sort of linguistic forms of data that can be analyzed to detect mental health risk signals. But there's also all kinds of non-linguistic data that are used in various applications as well. So in one of my favorite studies, this group in 2017 was able to extract 40,000 photos from 166 Instagram users to try to identify photogenic markers of depression based on the photos that they posted to Instagram. Okay, so in this set of 166 users, a little less than half had self-reported a diagnosis of depression. All right, so the models these researchers built use only computationally generated features like pixel analysis, face detection, metadata parsing to try to predict the onset of depression. Right, and so this will be important in a minute, but like one of the main features they said of this research that was the most important is that this is all automated, right? It can be done in the background with no active intervention from users, so therefore it can be done at massive scale when you consider the number of people who are posting photos to Instagram. Right. So the best performing algorithm in the study that they reported was a random forest classifier, which was able to reliably distinguish between posts made by depressed and non-depressed individuals using only those automatically computationally generated features, right? So they're not looking at the language, they're not looking at any of the captions or any of the likes or shares or anything, like just these computational features of the images were enough to reliably distinguish depressed from non-depressed individuals. And the most striking aspect of this paper was that these signals seemed to be detectable even before the date of the user's first self-reported diagnosis, right? So just looking at features like hue and brightness and saturation in an Instagram photo, they were able to sort of do historical forms of prediction to identify who is likely to go on to report depression even before the people themselves would have self-reported a diagnosis. Right. And so that's a striking finding, right? I don't think many people would have predicted that something as simple as, how many faces are in an image or what's the hue on this image that's posted would be sufficient to reliably predict who would go on to report a diagnosis of depression. Okay, so I don't want to, as you can probably anticipate, right, in the third section of the talk, these studies will come in for some criticisms, right? But I don't think we should sort of overstate just how impressive and I think antecedently unlikely we would have thought that would have been, right? So I think results like this are quite impressive. So a similar approach in a paper called Deep Mood from 2017 used deep learning to predict mood disruption and depression from mobile phone typing metadata. Okay, so again, what's striking about this study is they're not looking at like the first order semantic information about like what people are texting, right? They're not looking and saying, oh, I'm really sad, therefore predicting they're depressed. No, they're just looking at metadata in this study, right? So they enrolled 40 subjects in an 8-week experiment. So 12 of them were diagnosed with bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. And they installed on all of these subjects' smartphones a custom keyboard that collected metadata for key presses on alphanumeric characters. Okay, so again, not looking at the sort of semantic content of the messages being typed out, but only metadata features such as how the duration of a key press, the time since the last key press, the distance from the last key press, as well as some high-level metadata from the accelerometer in the smartphone. Right. And so the idea was that they wanted to see if they could use these metadata features to predict scores on widely used depression scales like the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale or the Young Mania Rating Scale. Right. And so their deep learning algorithm, Deep Mood, achieved over 90% accuracy. And what was so striking about this is that it was able to sort of, when you look at the graphs, like sort of plateau at around this 90% level after only 400 typing sessions, right? Where they define a typing session as a typing session is one where it begins with a key press, which occurs after 5 or more seconds have elapsed since the last key press, and continues until 5 or more seconds elapse between key presses. Right. So probably some of you in the audience have already engaged in like 4 or 5 of these typing sessions. And so when you think about how often many of us use our smartphone, right, we can get 400 of these typing sessions easily within the context of one day, if not a few hours. And just the metadata from a relatively small number of these typing sessions is enough to be able to reliably predict things like mania and depression. Okay, so again, this is another finding where I just think like, a priori, no, probably no one would have thought that there would be a sufficient signal in metadata, right? Not looking at the content of what someone's typing, but just in the metadata to be able to reliably distinguish, depressed from non-depressed individuals, or individuals in a manic state or not in a manic state. Okay, so again, I think incredibly impressive and incredibly unintuitive, but also very insightful kind of finding, right? I mean, again, this sort of runs passively in the background, right? You don't have to schedule an appointment with your therapist to do this, right? You just have to go about your day, right? Texting as you do, scrolling as you do, and that might be enough to uncover signals relevant to the diagnosis of mental health, right? So that's really, I think, nothing short of impressive. Okay, so the last study I'll talk about in this vein is another metadata study involving large-scale Wi-Fi. Okay, so a group of researchers at the University of Connecticut published a couple papers in 2020, which were using features extracted from the Wi-Fi infrastructure on campus to do large-scale depression screening and depression detection on campus. Right, so they had 182 college students, 58 of them with depression. And so they collected movement and location data from association logs captured at Wi-Fi access points on campus, right? So notice you're not having the students install an app on their phone or even necessarily consent to be in a study. This is just the case where when you log on to the university Wi-Fi network, as probably all of us in this room are, you can go to the IT department, look at the Wi-Fi association logs, and extract like incredibly rich and detailed behavioral insights about people's movement patterns, where they go, how long they spend. And so what is interesting about, and I'm sure you could do this on any campus, right, is these association points are often specific to individual buildings, right? So there'll be specific identifiable Wi-Fi networks for this building, which will be distinct from the coffee shop, which will be distinct from the library or the gym, right? And so you're able to infer the type of building that people are going to while they're connected to the Wi-Fi network. So you can see, are they in a class building? If so, for how long? Are they in the library? If so, for how long? Are they at a sporting event? Is it entertainment? Is it food, right? All this can be inferred from the metadata in the Wi-Fi association logs. Right? So you're able to extract things like the duration of stay, the number of buildings visited, the different number of buildings visited. All of this can be gathered from Wi-Fi infrastructure without any direct data collection from the smartphone. Right? So sort of definition of passive, wide-scale data collection. Right? And so what I think was particularly impressive about this study is that they used sort of relatively straightforward, off-the-shelf support vector machine models, and were able to predict responses to widely used depression measures like the Patient Health Questionnaire 9 and the Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptomology, right? So nothing particularly, high dimensional or fancy or computationally sophisticated here. And again, this metadata is allowing them to predict individual depressive symptoms, so like individual items on these scales with accuracy as high as 87%. Okay, so that varied a little bit depending on what symptom was being looked at. But again, like, who would have thought that the metadata in the Wi-Fi association logs on a campus could be leveraged to deliver insights like that? I just think it's, it's very impressive, the ability to do that passively at scale at a time where we know many students are suffering with mental health on campus, right? We shouldn't discount just how impressive and potentially useful that is. Right, so there's a lot more that I could have surveyed there, could have given a whole day-long workshop on all these approaches, right? But I take it that those will at least suffice for giving you a sense of what some of these methods are, how they're being used. And I think we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want. I mean, I think they are representative in the way that AI and machine learning are being used to approach mental health. But now the question I want to turn to is, like, now that you've sort of had a sense, or you've heard me talk a little bit about the importance of participatory research methods and the kind of benefits that participatory research methods can deliver on the one hand, and then you've got a sense of the way people are using AI and machine learning to diagnose and identify mental illness on the other, now I want to ask, do these two things go together, right? Are they compatible? Or is there a kind of tension, right? Is there a reason to think that they might not mesh as much as you might think at first? Right. So when we get into the ethics of all this, there are obvious issues about things like data privacy and informed consent, right? So, when you agree to the university's Wi-Fi policy, are you giving informed consent to take part in these research studies for large scale depression, right? So, okay, on the one hand, sure, yeah, I clicked agree. I agree with the terms. I mean, I just did that, right, to log into the guest network. Yeah, okay, I clicked agree, but like, did I really know what I was clicking? No, of course not, right? I couldn't tell you a single thing that I just agreed to, right? And when I teach these classes, I ask people like, hey, what did you agree to in the terms of services of LinkedIn, right? No one can tell me a single thing they agreed to, but of course you've, signed away 15 to 20 of your fundamental human rights and agreeing to those terms and services, right? So that's a sort of important issue. I don't mean to downplay. I'm just not going to talk about it here, right? You can talk about efficacy, right? How accurate are these tools for identifying depression, right? Those are important ethical issues. I'm not going to talk about them here. There are important issues related to the different standards we use in kind of clinical academic medicine on the one hand versus commercial applications on the other. So again, very important and pressing issue, but not one I want to focus on here. Instead, I want to ask, are the use cases I just described in the second section compatible with the ability for stakeholders, again, individually or collectively, to speak for themselves and be heard on their own terms? And do they capture the value and richness of lived experience? Okay, so those are the questions I focus on, recognizing there's, of course, lots of other ethical and legal issues that are worth discussing as well. All right, so let's start with this idea of speaking for yourself. Right, so you might recall from the second section of the talk, I showed some empirical evidence that natural language processing methods are some of the most widely used to study mental health, right? And then you sort of combine that with this idea from the first section of the talk that participatory approaches dictate that people ought to be able to speak for themselves on their own terms, right? So at first pass, you might think that these two things would go really, really well together. Right? We've got these new methods for sort of allowing people to speak on their own terms, for capturing that speech in ways that are easier than ever before. And so you might think that this is just a really exciting development from the perspective of these participatory methods I described in section 1. But I think that there are some worries, right, that I want to raise. I think there are some reasons to suspect that they might not fit as neatly as you might think. Right. So I think that one of the things that Phoebe and I have written about in a few papers is that using text mining approaches specifically on electronic health record or electronic medical record data has this problem of, I think, systematically distancing participants from the research process by relying on clinical notes and indirect observations written by healthcare professionals, right? So it's like almost by definition, the sorts of things that get entered into fields in the electronic medical records are the physician's or the healthcare provider's interpretation of what the patient might have said, right? So they're often direct, sometimes they're direct, but they're often indirect observations, and almost never are individuals allowed to directly contribute information into their medical record, right? It has to be filtered through and approved by the healthcare provider. And again, not to say that there's not good reasons for that, but it is worth just noting that, like, in general, most of us can't just go to our healthcare providers and say, hey, I'd like to make sure this is in my notes, right? We don't just have direct access to it, and we often can't, edit it, even if we wanted to. And so I think that should make us worry about the ability of any of these methods to capture the ability for people to speak for themselves on their own terms. Right. I think that data that gets encoded into health records in this way systematically replaces the voice of the patient with the voice of the clinician. Right. And so we know from a number of really good studies that there are well-documented biases that occur when this happened. So this, famous paper published in Science has to do with gender and racial biases and the ways that healthcare providers tend to treat the reports of pain very differently from patients of color versus white patients, right? These are all well known by now. So of course, there's those risks about encoding various forms of implicit or explicit biases in the data. But again, I think the issue here is like more structural, or it's more systematic, right? So the massive amount of data required to generate useful predictions in these text mining approaches requires significant input standardization, right? And so in order to be able to generate useful predictions, you got to compare oranges to oranges, apples to apples, as it were. And so that necessarily requires abstracting away from and potentially erasing the voice of the patient. Right. And so what I'm concerned about from the perspective of the participatory research I described in the first section is that this kind of method, right, where we're relying on indirect observations entered into a healthcare record by a provider, that it sort of reifies or it solidifies this distinction between expert researchers who have the authority to define the experiences of mental health on the one hand, and then those with mental illnesses who are just mere objects of study, right? They're like there to have their data extracted so that it can be put into a machine readable format in the EHR so we can build systems level predictive models to, forecast demand or something, right? And so I think what often happens is that distinction between, who's the expert and then who has the authority to speak about the condition, right? It just gets sort of baked in, right? And it's sort of uncritically assumed on the perspective of many NLP and data science researchers who are just given, you're sort of given the data set, right? And sort of, so it's like, here's the health record, right? Now build some predictive analytics. There's not really space, or at least it's very difficult to make space to question, like, well, whose perspective is actually represented here? Right? Who's actually speaking on behalf of whom, and do they have the authority to do so? Right? So that's the worry. And so I think that the insights from the first section of this talk about the value and richness of lived experience and the importance of being able to speak for oneself, right? They're going to challenge and they're going to say, like, we should be especially careful, or we should be especially wary of any approach that solidifies or reifies that distinction between, experts on the one hand and mere objects of study on the other. Right. And so another way to put this is that, like, I sort of worry that as we become more and more enamored and endeared by these big data approaches of, mining electronic health records for new insights, that it engenders this attitude in not only clinicians, but in data scientists and even patients themselves, where, like, we're just treated as, like, predictors, right? Or as covariates, right? We're treated as like vectors in the space of data rather than like humans in the space of reasons and rationality and hopes and dreams and desires, right? And so I sort of worry what that sort of attitude, if it's inculcated over, long periods of time across large parts of sectors, like I do worry, right? That can have some negative impacts on the kind of human side of healthcare delivery. Right. And so I think the participatory approaches I described in the first section can be a nice counterbalance to that, or at least they can help us see some of the potential risks and limitations, as the talk suggests, right, of treating people more like data points rather than more like persons. All right, so I'm not going to read this whole quote, right? But I just want to highlight that I'm not the only one sort of making these arguments. A recent systematic review pointing out some of these same issues, right? That there's this imperative in much text mining of electronic health records to focus on relatively standardized or structured inputs that often comes at the expense of more narrative or qualitative based inputs that, any sort of mental health provider will, be likely to tell you, like, that's the core of what they do, is sort of learning patients' stories, right? Helping them to make sense of their stories in a way that's often not neatly or easily captured in the structured formats that you're required to work within in electronic health record systems. Right. Another feature of this review is that only 10% of the studies in the most recent systematic meta-analysis included service users at all. Right. So that sort of signals to me that, like, that's that imbalance, right? Where we just have 90% of the time, it's just the clinician speaking on behalf of the people suffering from the illness. Only 10% of the time are we hearing from the people themselves. Service users are not always able to access clinical notes, right? We're unable to correct mistakes. So this is changing with some recent legislation in the US, but still on the whole, it's not easy to do. It's often sort of on the ground very difficult for people who don't know how to navigate bureaucracies, right? To be able to access these records and to change them if they're factually incorrect. And so, what all of that leads me to conclude is that, like, these are some of the most commonly used methods we see in mental health research, right? This text mining. So I think some of the most commonly used methods we have seem, at least on the surface, to be potentially incompatible with this commitment to the participatory turn, right? And so that's not to say that, like, we should never use them or that it's all bad, but it is just to say that, like, insofar as they are incompatible, they seem unlikely to deliver the benefits that we described in section 1, right? And so I think that is a cause for concern. Okay, so now I want to move to some discussions or a similar kind of analysis through the lens of the other participatory principle about the value and richness of first-person experience. All right, so recall this first one again, respecting the value and richness of first-person lived experience. So I think that a distinctive feature. And so here, this is where I think the analysis will generalize way beyond mental health or even healthcare to just many data science approaches in general. Many of the examples I described in section 2, but again, I think this applies to many approaches in data science more generally, require stand-ins or proxies, right? And so in this case, stand-ins or proxies for mental health, which I want to say, or at least I'm going to put forth, run the risk of abstracting away from and subsequently devaluing first-person experience, right? And so this phenomenon is so widespread that it's almost difficult. I mean, it's like really hard to even notice that we're doing it sometimes. It's just so obvious. It's sort of like, it's like the air we breathe or the water we swim in, right? So in almost all the studies that I showed you, and then almost in the entire literature for machine learning and mental health, the standard method is to use predictive methods in machine learning to predict scores on readily available, easy to collect symptom scales, right? That is like almost always the variable that's being predicted is a score on a symptom scale. So we've seen some examples, the Hamilton scale, the patient health questionnaire, the quick inventory of depressive symptoms, right? Almost always what we're predicting is a 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 9 scale symptom scale, right? And so it's easy to forget that we're doing that. And many papers and many researchers and presentations, slip into the language of saying, well, we're predicting depression, right? We're predicting anxiety. And the fact is they're not, right? They're predicting a score on a rating scale, right? And so I think that there's it's almost like a question of, this is, when I teach my data science ethics class, I always say, one of the most important questions that you have to figure out is what are you actually measuring, right? You think that you're measuring depression, and in fact, you're measuring a response on the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, which again, ideally is hopefully very highly correlated with depression, but it's a stand-in. Right? It's a stand-in for it. So what you're predicting, your prediction variable is a score on a symptom scale, right? And I want to say, look, there's nothing wrong with that in itself, right? This is what we have to do. Like we have to use stand-ins to develop measurements and build predictive models. So there's nothing in and of itself wrong with using a stand-in. Okay, so for me, where I think the problem comes in is when we sort of slip into this tendency of forgetting that it was a stand-in. Right. And so it's very easy to forget that we're just using a proxy, right? But stand-ins can be failed to recognize as such, and they can come to be treated as the very thing they're standing in for, right? And so this is an idea that going all the way back to the 1890s, William James recognized. He called it the psychologist's fallacy, right? And so I think that this, again, is so widespread, it's easy to forget, or it's easy to sort of not even recognize that we're doing it. But I think the consequences can be profound, actually. Right. And so if we, have a look within the literature of some of these critiques from the history of psychiatry and the critiques leveled by service user communities sort of at the medical establishment and the way that they study and treat mental health, we see, again, 30 or 40 years of publications, activism, work that is critiquing the widespread use of these symptom scales. Right. As the name suggests, symptom scales often focus exclusively on symptoms. Right? And symptoms are often assumed to represent the manifestation of illness. Okay, and so in some contexts, again, that's totally fine. That seems straightforward and accurate. Well, what I think is especially salient in the mental health context is that by definition, these symptom scales fail to capture other aspects of experience that may matter more to people than the manifestation of symptoms. Right? And so if you're just asking about a symptom, like, it's really hard in the way that these scales are designed to ask like other questions, right? So for some people, the alternative might be worse, right? They might prefer a bad presence of a symptom to an even worse or more debilitating side effect from a medication, right? So while, yeah, it might suck that I have, tremor for someone with advanced Parkinson's, say, right? They might say, look, like the presence of the symptom of tremor is really bad. But what's even worse than that for me is the fact that that I can't like hold my grandson or something, right? And so they might just say like, yeah, the presence of that is bad, but like, if that's the side effect of the medication, like maybe I'll deal with it so I can spend more time with my grandson, right? And so the idea is that like the straightforward symptom scales don't leave room for those kinds of questions to be asked, much less answered. right? So we see that with side effects, we see this with social support networks, engagement in meaningful activities, housing status, right? And the list can go on. So there is a recent trend and a push towards more kind of focus on like quality of life, measuring quality of life more broadly rather than specific manifestation of symptoms. But again, like if you're just a machine learning researcher or a data scientist who's given, access to a massive electronic health record data set, right? You're just sort of uncritically importing like everything that's built into those symptom scales, right? You're just, you don't have the opportunity to go back and ask the people, yeah, I know that side effect was bad, but like, was it worse than the symptom, right? All you get is the score on the symptom scale, right? Strongly agree, the pain was worse yesterday than it was the day before, right? Like that's what you're allowed to predict and infer. So I think to kind of take a step back, right, what this shows is that the reliance on symptom scales implicitly dictates or sort of encodes the value implicitly that what matters and what is worth measuring is the presence of clinical symptoms rather than other things that might pop up in a patient's life. Right. So again, there's a sort of push towards broader quality of life scales and development of those measurements. But the point is just that, like, given the way the sort of pipeline for much research in data science and machine learning, there's just not space to kind of ask those questions, right? Insofar as you're predicting a score on a scale, right, you don't have the opportunity to have a sense of like, well, how important was that symptom on that scale to that person? It's just, you get it, right? 5.6 out of 7. Okay, so I want to go back now to the Instagram study that was looking for these photogenic markers of depression. Right, this is another, I think, interesting way that this dynamic of stand-ins takes place. Right, so when we kind of revisit that study through the lens of these two participatory principles that I've introduced, it should be quite clear that approaches like this are processing stand-ins for the first-person experience of depression. Right. And I want to say, look, like, obviously, social media posts contain mental health relevant information. Right. And for many people who may only get to see a therapist or a psychiatrist once a week or once a month, there's a whole lot of white space in there between visits that, mining social media data can help to sort of fill in. OK, so no doubt there is relevant information in there. But I think we should also be pretty honest and clear that social media posts represent very, very limited aspects of persons, right? It's more than nothing for sure, but they're very often crude stand-ins for cognitive and affective states subject to obvious things like social desirability, right? So it's not that it's nothing, right? But these are very, very crude approximations, right? They're very crude stand-ins often. Now, when we're thinking about that Instagram study though, note that the predictive power of those models is derived from stand-ins of those very, very crude stand-ins, right? So when you're looking at pixel level averages, number of faces detected in an image, the brightness and saturation and hue, right? Here now, we're at least 2 steps removed from anything resembling the first-person experience of mental illness, right? So we're sort of looking at these almost, computationally generated metadata features on very crude stand-ins of people's experience. Okay. And again, I want to be clear that I'm not just criticizing this for the sake of criticizing. That's an incredibly useful and surprising and important finding, but it needs to be properly contextualized as processing stand-ins for the phenomenon that we're presumably interested in understanding, right, and in curing and in improving. And so the same thing can be said for the typing metadata study that I mentioned, right? The scores. Right, this is just a straightforward example of importing the scores on a symptom scale as stand-ins for mental illness, which we then predict with features as impersonal as like the time between a key press. Okay, amazingly impressive that we can extract that signal from a noisy environment. Not to downgrade that, but to just recognize, right, how sort of impersonal that is in a way. How we're looking at stand-ins for stand-ins of the phenomenon of interest. Right. So, one thing that I'm concerned about from the perspective of participatory research methods is that the automated and scalable and passive nature of many of these approaches I described in the second section, these are often touted as the primary benefits. Right. So in that, in a different paper by the group out of UConn, right, they reportedly highlight how the data is collected passively without any effort from the users. Right. And so on the one hand, like, that's amazing. It allows for, a huge and rich data set. But on the other, that sounds like the exact opposite of the participatory methods we looked at in the first section of the talk. right? Like you don't have to do anything. You're not involved at all. Just keep going. Literally do nothing. Don't participate at all. Just keep going about your day, right? So it's like it's the opposite. And so while there are benefits to that, right, doing things at that sort of large scale, no doubt there's benefits. We also need to recognize the limitations inherent in those approaches, right? So when the method of data collection is entirely passive in this way, it leaves us unable to query users, for example, to ask like, are there other relevant features that you would want to consider, right? Does this capture your experience of the mental illness that you would like to resolve or get better, right? So you're sort of systematically unable to answer those sorts of questions when you exclude the people by definition and just say, this is all going on in the background, it's automatic, it's passive, right? So again, not to always degrade these approaches, but just to say, well, we need to recognize the costs. Like, while there are clear benefits for this sort of wide scale screening, there are significant costs too, right? And so this is just one of them. So one of the last things I'll touch on here is a sort of pet peeve of mine. I think these examples and many others from the literature sort of overstate the difficulty of moving from an algorithmic prediction on the one hand to a clinical intervention that demonstrably improves the outcomes of a patient on the other, right? And so there's often seems to be this assumption that like, oh, okay, like, great, we can predict the onset of depressive symptoms, 48 hours early by looking at people's Instagram posts or whatever, right? So that's a, amazing predictive feat, but like nothing in that method tells us like how we ought to actually intervene. Right? It just assumes that I guess there's resources that we'll connect people with that are going to be effective in helping them manage their depression. I don't know, right? So there's just this gap, right, that I've described in a few papers. We call it the prediction intervention gap, right? That just because you developed a prediction for something doesn't mean that an intervention naturally or obviously follows in a way that improves the quality of people's lives, right? And so I think to see this most clearly, right, in the context of the studies I've mentioned, it should be pretty obvious to you that like, if you're looking at those studies, no one thinks that like decreasing the number of milliseconds between your key presses or turning up the color saturation on your Instagram posts is going to reduce depression, right? Of course, no one would think that. Well, why is that, right? Philosophy of Science 101. Well, those are indicators of mental illness, not causes of it. We want our interventions to target causes, not indicators, right? But very often these predictive methods are just allowing us to predict various indicators. And just because we can identify an indicator is not the same thing as developing an intervention into the causes, right? And so I think that difficulty or that gap is very often under-acknowledged and underappreciated. All right, so to wrap up, I hope I made this clear that I'm not opposed to the use of AI, ML in mental health research, right? That's not the message I want to give across. What I'm trying to say is that commonly used methods may have this tendency to erase participants' voices and devalue their first-person experience, right? And sometimes that may well be justified, right? So in certain kinds of public health contexts, right, maybe you just say like, given this public health problem, like the first-person experience isn't really the most important thing, right? So that's not to say it can't be overridden or that we can't give justifications for it, but it is just to say that I think that they have this tendency to erase voices and devalue first-person experience. Now, I also want to be clear that the same phenomenon happens in non-AI and ML research, right? My colleague and collaborator in this project, Kieran, right, he thinks that this is fundamental, right? He thinks the whole discipline of psychology has gone wrong and ceased, he said 50 years ago, we stopped studying people and now all we study are variables, right? So he thinks this goes like, across all the social sciences. We don't care about people anymore. We study variables and relationships between variables. So, arguments like that will say there's nothing unique about AI here, right? We've been doing this, in many other non-AI contexts for a long time. So I'm totally willing to sort of grant that. So I think what I wanted to sort of walk away with, though, is sort of highlighting the importance of trying to strike a balance between the very real and tangible and obvious benefits that AI and ML approaches can offer on the one hand, with the ethical and epistemic perils or risks or dangers of treating people like data points rather than persons on the other hand, right? So just in other words, not only talking about what are the benefits to these approaches, but like what are the costs and how can we weigh those and how can we make sure that we're striking the right balance? So the last point I'll make here before wrapping up is that I think that it's common now, and I'm sure many of you have sort of heard these calls for human-centered AI or human in the loop or human-centric data science, right? And so I think that's a laudable effort in many ways, right? Like making these quantitative approaches more human-centered. But what I hope that this kind of analysis through participatory research methods has shown is that like it's not so obvious, right, who that is, right? So when we're calling for these predictive models in healthcare, for example, to be more human-centered, well, like who gets to be the human in human-centered, right? Is it the clinician with the clinical expertise, or is it the person suffering from the illness, right? So I think very often those kinds of questions get elided over when we're talking about human-centric data science or human-centric AI. And so I think at the very least, I hope that the considerations from the talk today will get us to question, well, who's the human? Right? Who's the human that gets to be in the loop, or who is the human that these computational approaches are centered around? All right, so that's all I have. Looking forward to your questions, and thanks for your attention. Sure, yeah, I can see the blinkies.
Okay, so I pushed the button, it was green, then it flashed green, and now it's red. So,
and we can all hear you.
Yeah, and so if you want to ask a question, do the same thing, press the button, you'll be in the queue. And I did it first, partly just to make that announcement, but I really appreciate, I do have some questions. I really appreciate, your presentation and the summary of the issues, and the fact that I think they're generalizable, not just to mental health, but, just about everything. And I'm not sure if I'm more depressed now than I was an hour ago, but I think it's fascinating and frightening, because I clicked, I agree.